Hello and welcome to TV Barbados. I'm your tutor and today we're going to look at Economics, Unit 1, Paper 2, and we are going to be doing question number 1. So if you have your paper, you can just get it and let's work along together. Alright, so this is the paper and the first question is asking us to define each of the following terms, and those terms are the law of equi-marginal utility and producer surplus. So let's start with the law of equi-marginal utility. The law of equi-marginal utility states that a consumer constrained by a limited budget will attain maximum satisfaction. In other words, you have optimal consumption when the marginal utility per dollar of the goods that he or she desires are equal. Right? So it has to be the marginal utility per dollar, not just the marginal utility, but the marginal utility per dollar. So we could write it in algebraic form as the marginal utility of X divided by the price of X should be therefore equal to the marginal utility of Y divided by the price of Y, which could be equal to the marginal utility of Z divided by the price of Z all the way down. Right? So that was all these utilities, marginal utilities per dollar are the same. Then we have equi-marginal utility. Producer surplus is the economic benefit that accrues to the producer when the market price that he or she receives is greater than the lowest price he or she was willing to accept for the goods that they have produced. In essence, then, producer surplus is the difference between the total revenue gained by the producer and the marginal cost of producing those goods. All right, if you can't visualize that algebraically, in graphical form, that is that lower left triangle of the demand supply curve, which is bordered by the market equilibrium price, the supply curve, and the y-axis. Right. Let's move to part B. B says we're going to have the individual's utility from consuming units of chocolate bars and candy bars. So we're given a table, and in this table we're going to be required to work out the marginal utility and the marginal utility per dollar. All right, so let's bring it up. That's the question there. It says complete the table given that the price of one chocolate bar is $4 and the price of one candy bar is $2. So remember, marginal utility is the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity consumed or demanded. All right, so we will notice that here the change in these quantities is 1, right? 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. All those changes are 1. So technically, we just want the change in the total utilities. So from 0 to 40 is 40. That's for the chocolate. And 22 for the candy bar. From 40 to 72 in the chocolate, that is 32. And for the candy bars, 22 to 42 is 20. For the chocolate bar, 72 to 96 is 24. And 42 to 16 for the candy bar is 18. So we have all the marginal utilities. Now we want the marginal utility per dollar, which means we're going to take these utilities, these marginal utilities, and divide them by the price. So the chocolate is $4 and the candy is $2. So 40 divided by 4, 10. 32 divided by 4, 8. 24 divided by 4, 6. And for the candy bar, 22 divided by 2, 11. 20 divided by 20 is 10. 20 divided by 2 is 10. And 18 divided by 2 is 9. All right, so we've answered that question. So let's go to the second part of the question, which says, explain why the optimal bundle of the two goods would be 1 unit of chocolate bars and 2 units of candy bars. Now this should be easy because we already answered this question, theoretically speaking. Right? So based on the law of equi-marginal utility, a consumer's optimal bundle of two goods is attained when the marginal utility per dollar of one good is the same as the marginal utility per dollar of the other good. Hence, in this case, the maximum satisfaction for this consumer occurs with one chocolate bar and 2 candy bars because both of them have the same marginal utility per dollar of 10. So if you look at the table, you will see that one chocolate bar gives a marginal utility of 10, right? And 1 and 2 candy bars give a marginal utility of 10. All right, so let me highlight that for you again. So 1 chocolate bar is 10 and 2 candy bars 10. They both have the same marginal utility per unit. Hence, that is the reason why that is the optimal bundle for that. All right. Good. So let's continue with our question. So part C says, with the aid of a well-labeled diagram, assess the total effect of the imposition of an indirect tax on candy bars. All right, so with the aid of a well-labeled diagram. Now, I've already drawn up my diagram. Of course, it's written scrappy, but in the exam, you have to do nicey. You just got to do it well enough for the person to read. But I'm going to actually bring it up so you can follow how I arrive at this. So give me a moment. All right, so let's assume that this is my demand for the candy bars, right? That's my demand slope there for the candy bars. And this is my supply curve for the candy bars. So clearly, I have the consumer surplus and the producer's surplus. Good. Now, let's say that the government decides to impose this tax, right? So this blue line is going to be the tax that the government is going to impose. So let's say the imposition of the tax shifts the price from where it is to that position there where the blue line has now stopped. What can you see happened? So what we notice is that this was the price before the tax, right? That dotted line there was the price before the tax. And this was the quantity before the tax. All right, good. Now that the tax is imposed, notice that the price rises because obviously a tax causes an increase in the price. That increase in price forces the consumer to reduce his or her demand. In other words, put them in disequilibrium, so they have to adjust their budget to access the quantity of items they could afford at this new price. And so the price, as you would notice, that increase in price would reduce their surplus by whatever was the increase in the price, right? In other words, the benefit that the consumer enjoyed, right, has now been reduced because of the increase in price. So whereas the amount that they were willing to pay and what they were asked to pay had this big gap, now that gap has been reduced by the tax. Well, similarly, the producer also suffers because this decline in the quantity demanded will mean that the producer's revenue would also fall because you're selling less goods. Yeah, it'd be at a higher price, but you're not getting any more money. So the gain that you were getting in revenue above your marginal cost has now decreased by that distance between what was the original price and now where that green line falls. All right, so if we put in all the information, we will see what actually happens. So the tax shifts the price up, right? And that causes the consumer to reduce the quantity that they demand, and that, as it were, cuts out some of their surplus. It also reduces the producer's profits, and therefore they lose some of their surplus. So in all, the total welfare is reduced by the burden of the tax on both the consumer and the producer. And notice that also it will create some deadweight loss, but we're not really concerned with that. All right, so you got the gist, so let's see if we can write an answer. All right, so let's write the answer. Good. So the imposition of a tax on the candy bar will cause the price of candy to rise from PE to PT. And this in turn will reduce the consumer's economic welfare that they previously enjoyed. Similarly, the producer's surplus would also decline because the shift in price will lead to a decrease in demand from QE to QT, which means obviously that you've reduced their profits. All right, and as a result, total welfare will decrease by the level of the burden placed on both the consumer and the producer, as shown in the area represented by PTA PSB, right? That colored area there. Good. Now that erosion of welfare, the majority of it, right, will go to the government as tax revenue. Of course, there will also be deadweight loss because there will be some persons, both consumers and producers, who would not be able to operate at that new price. All right, so that will result in deadweight loss. But otherwise, the decline in the total welfare accrues to the government as tax revenue. Well, that is the end of question 1, and you just got to keep practicing and see where we go from here. So until next time, when we meet again, as we always say, 8-9.